Hello.
Mm,
Good morning.
Still gathering.
Yeah. All right. All right. So welcome to the meeting. Um, so this week we did DevoWorm once again, and I want to go over the video and I want to show what we did. So we had a presentation from Hussein. He talked about a paper that he's working on. This is a theory paper that it's based on the idea of non-transitivity in biological systems. And he was showing us that paper. And he actually, I think he posted it in the Slack if people are interested in reading through it. It has a lot of moving parts. So it's like a working paper. And we're, talking about how to apply it to different systems. So the thing about a theory, you can develop a theory, but you have to kind of think about examples of where you can apply it and that sort of thing. So that's one thing we talked about. A lot of things having to do with dynamical systems, and we talked about the side blotch lizards, which is an example of non-transitivity. So this is where we have the three lizard phenotypes, and each of the lizard phenotypes have a unique advantage over the other, and so they can beat any other combination. So, for example, if you have three lizards, the yellow one can beat both orange and blue. Blue can beat both orange and yellow, and orange can beat yellow and blue, depending on the strategy. So if you know anything about rock, paper, scissors, you know that any one strategy can always beat any other strategy at any given time. It just depends on the strategy you're showing at the time. And so this is a nice intuitive way of thinking about this in nature and biology with lizard behaviors, because they have, as it turns out, they evolve different strategies, different ecological strategies based on their phenotype. So if they have a orange phenotype or a yellow phenotype or a blue phenotype, they have a different strategy that they pursue, and then the populations fluctuate accordingly. And so we had a little chat about that. A while back in DevoWorm, we talked about something called Laws of the Game. And this was a book that was put up by Manfred Eigen and another author I'm not thinking of right now, Winkler. And this was where they were thinking about game theory and applying it to different types of natural systems, biological systems, physics, etc. And they use these classes of bead games to achieve this, this sort of systems characterization. So they would play these bead games and they would map the system to the game, the states of the game, and things like that. And then they would measure the outcome. So this is, game theory. We usually associate that with von Neumann and Morgenstern, and they did have a large role to play in the development of game theory. Also, John Conway did a lot of things with game theory. Manfred Eigen we usually associate with the hypercycle and sort of origin of life type stuff, where looking at these different cycles that emerge in biochemistry. But Manfred Eigen did a number of other things in complexity theory, including these types of games. So, and then of course, this is about the 50th anniversary of that book being published. So it was published sometime in the 70s, I think it was 75 or something like that. So we're right at the 50th anniversary of that book. And so this is where this paper comes in the journal Symmetry. And then, we went through this paper, and this was supposed to be a reflection on 50 years after Laws of the Game. So just kind of thinking about what they were trying to do with that book. And of course, at the time, people hadn't necessarily thought about game theory, a lot. I mean, they've thought about it some since like the 1950s, but there have been a lot of advancements since the early to mid 70s in that area. Certainly not in terms of characterizing things like chemical systems or biological systems, or even physical systems in a lot of ways. And when I mean physical systems, I don't mean the sort of the instantiations of them. I mean like the theoretical aspects of physics or chemistry or biology. So that was definitely, I think, a major advance when this book came out. Now, of course, they talked about what a game is, and so a game, we might think of a board game or a video game, and of course, you have players, you have strategy, you have outcomes. Those outcomes feed back to the player. The player acts on that outcome, and then they get hopefully a better outcome later. And so this is kind of the way we think about game theoretic modeling. We also sometimes just use the concept of a game as sort of a conceptual model. So we map sort of the dynamics of systems to the moves of a game. So you might map, say, for example, a natural system to chess or backgammon or some other game, and you map, you say that the strategies involved are very similar to the processes in this system, and we can simulate this on a computer, and we can get outcomes, we can get winners, and we can get strategies emerging. And so that's kind of the value here of this, is that it allows you to sort of model your system in a way that you can understand. It's not unlike something like reinforcement learning, where we have policies and we have improvements or optimizations of those policies. A lot of systems that we model with reinforcement learning don't necessarily have policies that they pursue, but we can extract a policy from the interactions. So that's all good. Another thing they talked about was symmetry breaking, which of course is important in developmental biology, in embryogenesis, where you have events that allow for the symmetry to be broken in some system, like an embryo, where you might have strong symmetry between halves, or between like the left and the right half, or between the anterior end and the posterior end. And development is about taking something that is a sphere, basically, and differentiating that into an organism, the shape of an organism. So that means that we have to have these symmetry breaking events where there's differentiation, maybe at one end versus another, or on one side versus another. And so these are just these events that unfold in development. And so you can model symmetry breaking using game theories, it turns out. We can model environmental fluctuations, but we can also model the aggregate outcomes of those fluctuations. And so this makes this very useful for developmental biology as well as biology in general. We published a paper in 2018 that kind of explored game theory in embryogenesis, using Stackelberg games and mapping that to an embryo. If you're interested in that paper, that's a paper I can pull out, and we can go into a little bit more detail. So then we had Shreyas, who's joined our group recently. He's interested in the graph neural networks project that we have in DevoWorm, and this is building on some of that work, and it's kind of a couple layers removed from sort of the broad idea of graph neural networks, but it's basically taking this connectome data set from C. elegans, where the connectome is defined by synaptic connections and fluctuations of those synaptic connections in larval development. And he's building these temporal graphs that, of course, change with changes in the connectivity. And so that's leading him to model ODEs on networks and model the dynamics of these connectomes. So it's really interesting work, and he's been presenting on this for the last couple of weeks. And so, he's thinking about how to model these connectomes, what are the features of these graphs? What can we get out of them? Can we make sure that this is a valid connectome? And, how do we connect that with graph neural networks? And for that matter, regular graphs. So you can draw graph representation and, it's maybe something that you just take out of the literature, but then you have to validate it and make sure that it gives you the right output if you're, say, trying to extrapolate between 2 points in time where the network changes its configuration. In other words, how do you know it evolves from one state to another state in a certain way? So this is why, kind of going over this, he's using an ODE solver plus a graph neural network approach to create a weight in space, and then using an encoder or decoder to extract that and visualize it. So this is, hopefully this is something that can be refined and used in a way that's useful to scientific investigation. And then, you can look at different problems in embryogenesis using this and in larval development. So he has here, you might be able to do some sort of differentiable axon growth model in this network. So you can actually look at how axons project out to different cells and get that information from both embryogenetic data and this larval data. So he introduced a couple of papers. This is one, a generative model of the connectome with dynamic axon growth. That's in network neuroscience. So this is just kind of looking at how people are building connectomes from generative models, something called connectome generative models. And, thinking about how people build these networks, build these graphs from data of axonal growth and axonal projection. And so, these are pretty intense papers, a lot of statistical parameters thrown around. And we were talking about some of the things about the structure of the graph. So in other words, looking at scale-free distributions of nodes and of connections, and then, looking at optimizing for certain parameters and getting certain outcomes that would basically mimic the C. elegans connectome. So the C. elegans connectome is a small world network in its adult form. It has scale-free properties, which mean that there's a lot of internal structure in these networks. And so what we have to kind of figure out is how do we get to that sort of network? Because we could use a random network as sort of a null hypothesis, saying, well, we have this random network, or at least the connectome kind of starts out as a random network, or maybe the synaptic connections start out as like quasi-random, and then they evolve to this sort of structured state. And so this makes sense as the organism learns, as it uses the connections and prunes other connections, you get the structure over time. Or it could be that the structure is more or less hard-coded and you just end up kind of refining an existing underlying structure to get to that point. So there are all sorts of things that we can explore, but we need to have a good mathematical representation of it. Okay, so yeah, we were looking at some really interesting things with dynamic networks. I like this approach because, you think about graphs and networks and you think about the static structure. And so it's really, important to remember that they evolve, especially in biology. Networks evolve over time and they change their topology many, many times over. And you have to understand, what are the relevant changes versus what is sort of noise or noisy change. And, what can we kind of pick out of that will say, I can understand different stages of development, or I can understand different ways, activity-dependent patterns in a connectome. Okay, yeah. And then just thinking about how things like the motor circuit are remodeled in C. elegans, which is, we understand the motor circuit, we maybe understand post-embryonic remodeling, but maybe not as much as we would like. And this is just kind of thinking about this process through modeling. Can we simulate the development of the motor circuit and, come up with plausible hypotheses, not only for how it works, but maybe how it doesn't work. And then it actually also brought up something about Euclidean modeling. So when we do Euclidean modeling, it's maybe easier to understand, but sometimes we don't get an accurate view of what's happening in the brain. So we have basically biology is all about curvature. So when we have a connection, it's not like a straight line from one neuron to the next. Things meander, things curve. And so you can use a hyperbolic space. And they talked about the Poincare ball method, or the Poincare ball model, which is a way to kind of pick a hyperbolic projection. So a hyperbolic projection is where you use a different underlying metric space, and it allows you to grow your volume exponentially, and you can get a better handle on the biological sort of organization, because the biological organization is not necessarily Euclidean. So, mapping out your connectome and hyperbolic space, it's very hard to do computationally, but it's very useful ultimately. All right, yeah, and then I reviewed this paper that Susan posted in the chat, and this is called Control of Tissue Flows and Embryo Geometry in Avian Gastrulation. This was a paper that featured Lagrangian coherent structures, which we've talked about in our groups for a while. It's basically this idea that you create a Lagrangian for different things moving around in the embryo, which is essentially a fluid, and you track cells that are migrating around in the embryonic tissue, and you can calculate from, say, like a common source point how these cells diffuse or migrate across that space. So, we can look at cell diffusion as sort of a random process, but we know it's not a random process because we don't see, like we see structures emerge. We don't just see more diffuse randomness. And so one of the things we can do, though, is to track these cells in an experimental context, or we can model cells as tracked objects. And we can go from like a central point out to where they form structures. They might form a ridge, they might form a cluster of things. And we can measure going from that common point or its point of origin out to the place where it ends up using some sort of dynamical systems approach. In this case, a Lagrangian, which describes the sort of the path, but it also gives you different types of physical parameters like position, motion, and acceleration. Now, if we do this for all the cells in the embryo, of course, we can end up getting a Lagrangian for all of them. And what tends to happen is, of course, the cells kind of go from their centralized point to some structure. So if we have like a ridge of tissue, a ridge of cells that form a tissue, or a cluster of cells that form a tissue, they all have their own origin point, and they all kind of go to a similar place. There's a pattern to their diffusion. And so we can describe that pattern as a Lagrangian coherent structure. That is, it's this this place in the space that we're tracking where things tend to end up. So originally we used Lagrangian coherent structures in terms of looking at things that float around in the ocean. So things that kind of move around in water in the ocean, and they end up in these gyres. Like, we talk about microplastics in the ocean. We have all these plastics in the ocean, and they all kind of follow the currents as they diffuse through the ocean. And they all end up in these ocean gyres, which are places in the ocean where the currents kind of like end up in a dead zone that kind of circle around. And that's typical of fluids. When you have migration in fluids, you end up with these gyres. And so that's what tends to happen. And then the idea is that you can identify these gyres from tracked objects and just their motion and where they end up over time. And so you can see this in the embryo. There's this whole cottage industry of applying Lagrangian coherent structures to embryogenesis, to embryos. It's a group out of Harvard, I believe, or Princeton. Matthias Serra is one of the main investigators on this. And they have this set of papers where they look at these dynamical systems models. They call it, I think, the morphogenetic skeleton or something like that, where they can build a skeleton of, or dynamic morphoskeletons, where they can build a model of cell migration using these kind of dynamical systems tools. And it gives us, I think, a better handle on a lot of symmetry breaking events, a lot of migration events, and how patterns form from, it is essentially like some sort of, it's not really randomness, it's more like non-structure. So that's where this is going. And I presented on this paper and kind of went through some of the figures. They give an example from avian gastrulation. So this is where you're getting a lot of bending and folding of the phenotype. You're getting these germ layers form, and you're getting some real first steps in terms of structuring the embryo and getting towards an adult form. And then they have avian gastrulation as a process, and then they have the dynamic morphoskeleton that they build from this. So they're extracting data from the embryo and they're building a model. Okay, so that was our DevoWorm meeting. I'm glad I could go through it in such detail because I wanted, oftentimes I just kind of give a short update on it, and I wanted to go through it a little more detail today. So Jesse is today in Princeton, New Jersey, and he's, been probably for the last decade been fascinated by the Princeton Envision Conference, and he, that's where he, I think, got started with like kind of thinking about these different types of events that he likes to explore. And the Envision event, I think, was the original Envision event kind of came out of the mid 2010s. And he's given the history of this in meetings prior. So I'll let him talk about this later. Maybe next week, where he'll kind of walk through his experience on this. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, him, just making it aware that he's there. I couldn't get in touch with him about, doing like a live stream from the event, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But he's at Envision this weekend, and there are a lot of things on technology and policy, on futurism, on the vision for the future of technology and things like that. So this is the conference schedule that he posted in the Slack. So 9 to 10:15 a.m. registration and breakfast, 10:15 to 11. Arvind Narayan is the director of CITP, AI and the Future of Jobs. Then there's the New Jersey AI Hub and Pallavi Nuka on the future of AI and policy. There's a lunch session with networking. There's Nate Walker and Alexander Krebitz on Rutgers AI and Human Rights panel. So it's very New Jersey oriented. Then at 2:10, there's Noah Brostel, Michelle Mons, Stephen Keltz, and this is on AI law and the future of governance. And then there's a coffee break. Then there are these dual sessions. So Edward Yu on AI and security, Benedict Lehnert on AI and entrepreneurship. So a very heavy focus on AI, as we might imagine. And it's this mix of ethics and futurism and social issues and other things like that. Then at 3:50, there's the MSA Rail team, Jesse Parent and Tammy Kwan, and I imagine that he'll tell us about his involvement in this. This is a session on the future of AI in education, which is, I think, something that he was talking about last time. stressing this idea that we can use AI responsibly. There are different ways we can implement it in our daily lives and in our interest areas, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But thinking about how to responsibly integrate it into our fields of expertise. And then, of course, the closing keynote from Stephen Keltz of Responsible AI. So good luck with Jesse on Princeton Envision for 2026. Maybe, we'll get an update from him next week. Okay, now I'm going to go over a little bit of work I've been doing, and this is not, I don't want to embarrass myself on this, but no, I'm going to go over some work that I've been doing with something called rotoscoping and using different AI tools to try to achieve rotoscoping, which is a artistic technique that is used in animation, but it can be used to process things like video. And so this is something that is kind of a hard problem to achieve, and it takes a lot of computational power. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to run it locally. So I'm trying to rotoscope on a local machine. I'm trying to rotoscope for maybe processing video or maybe creating artistic artifacts. And so as it turns out, rotoscoping is, this is something that people can do by hand, but it's extremely time consuming. It's shown up in movies, and of course with visual effects, it's very expensive, very time intensive, and it costs like computational power. So I'm going to be, the things that I'm doing with this, I'm going to be doing on a Mac Mini, or I've been doing them on a Mac Mini, like an M4 Mac Mini. So this is something that's, I think, well, I don't know. Now there's a run on Mac Mini, so I don't know if you can get your hands on one. But if you can, this is something you can do on a local machine. So rotoscoping is where we take an image and we want to animate things from a set of moving images. So this is Tom Cruise in a movie where he's talking on the phone, and the idea is you draw out each frame, you trace it out, you make a drawing, and then you animate those drawings so that they form this, motion. They embody motion. And you can do a lot of things using rotoscoping. You can remove backgrounds. You can segment out features, obviously. And you can also mask a moving image. This is on the right, this is an image of a moving cat. It's walking along the ground. I haven't done this, but I got this from the internet. Segmented out the background, segmented out the front ground. So the foreground is now just kind of one color. It's preserving the motion, at least in the extremities, and you're able to identify that as motion of a cat walking. So you're segmenting out parts of things. You're removing the background. You're also able to mask a moving image, so you can mask everything and then use that general mask across frames to convey motion. And so those are kinds of things you need rotoscoping. You can imagine like you can use this for movies. This has been used if you've watched the movie A Scanner Darkly with Keanu Reeves. This is where they rotoscope the entire movie. The whole thing is done in rotoscoping. So they shoot the movie and then they do the animations on top. So this is the technique that we're interested in. And this is very difficult because, it requires and up until recently, it's required a lot of, computational power. It's a tricky technique. And so, how do we do this sort of cleanly, maybe effectively, and maybe something that's affordable? Because there are a lot of tools that have rotoscoping in them, but the tools cost a lot of money. So there are a number of tools like professional videographer tools or video processing tools that have a rotoscoping feature in them. But for one thing, they're not necessarily always very good. Or another thing, that costs a lot of money to license and then to run. So actually, we can use the SAM2 model from Meta to do this. And so as it turns out, SAM2, we used SAM and SAM2 and DevoWorm to segment biological images. So to do things like segment out an embryo, and because the embryo is of course always moving around, we can acquire images from a microscopy stack, but we can also acquire images over time, and then we can animate that by segmenting out the background, segmenting the cell bodies, and then animating that, so we can see movement over time, and we can do things like build Lagrangian coherent structures, or we can build temporal graphs or other things like that. So, we can rotoscope things using machine learning models, essentially. And SAM2 is Meta's segment anything model, so this is open source, so this is not something that you necessarily have to pay a licensing fee for. So again, SAM2 is good at this sort of video segmentation where it can remove features across frames. There are different proprietary methods like Adobe After Effects. They have a Roto brush tool. They have VFX Paint Studio, which is also another rotoscoping tool. But again, these are expensive. And you don't necessarily want to invest in one of these tools if you're not a professional videographer or you're a movie studio doing special effects. And so again, SAM2 can be used to segment features and track across frames using OpenCV and a variational autoencoder. So this is an example from a Scanner Darkly. This is Keanu Reeves' face, and this is the whole movie is like this, where they've taken video and they've masked things and they've segmented out the background and they've done all sorts of things to augment the movie, the motion of the movie, and we get this fine movie that is really interesting, visually compelling. And we can do this with other things. So, we might take video where we, instead of having a green screen in back of us and projecting things on the green screen, we take a video and we segment out the background around a figure, around a person, and we put things in that background. And we can do that through rotoscoping. We can mask the background, we can take that out, and then we can put things in its place. And so it's a little bit different than this technique, or exactly how this technique is implemented, because you're not animating the person in the foreground. You're just doing things to the background. This is another example of rotoscoping where you're going from like a real image to an animation. And of course, this can be done by hand, but it's very time consuming, and you can do it with like professional video tools, but it's also very expensive. This is an article on the future of rotoscoping, AI automation, next-gen visual effects. So again, like I said, this has been used as a visual effects tool for probably 2 decades now. And it's great for if you're making a film with a several $1 million budget. But if you're trying to do this for, say, like a small business, or you're doing it for recreation, then it becomes much harder to justify doing. But it also opens up vistas for you in content creation, in a lot of modern video, not just filmmaking. We need to have visual effects. They can add on and become a core part of the storytelling. So we can do a lot of really interesting things with rotoscoping. And automating this process and making it cheaper and more accessible is, key to this. So rotoscoping, the process of tracing over or masking footage to isolate elements, that's the way they define rotoscoping here, has been essential in compositing, background replacement, wire removal, and countless visual effects tasks. Traditionally, it's been one of the most time-consuming and labor-intensive jobs in post-production. But now with AI automation and next-gen software, rotoscoping is undergoing a dramatic transformation. What once took days can now take minutes, and what was repetitive drudgery is turning into a hybrid process of human artistry and machine precision. So they used to do this by drawing things out frame by frame and then putting that all together in like a cartoon or some short film. Later on, you had these tools embedded in different packages where you would, put things in and the computer would render it, but there was a lot of kind of post-processing and pre-processing that needed to be done. It would take a long time, and it was expensive to do. So all these things, we want to reduce the cost, we want to reduce the time involved in doing this, we want to make it more accessible. So in this blog post, they're going to talk about how we might see this kind of be shaped in the future. So again, what is rotoscoping? They talk about how you can use it for wire removal in stunt scenes. You can use it in Star Wars. You can use it for like modeling lightsaber glows. So you have like, two people with sticks. Lightsabers aren't necessarily real. You could take two people fighting with sticks and you could render those as lightsabers where you have the sticks glowing and the sparks coming off of the sticks when they hit each other and things like that. So you can actually introduce visual elements. You can replace backgrounds, and green screens aren't perfect, or when you don't want to use a green screen for whatever reason. You can also do things like product replacements. This is where you're just, switching out elements in video, one thing for another. And then stylized effects like glowing outlines in music videos. So these are all things that we can do with these rotoscoping techniques. And so, again, manual rotoscoping is sort of the old way of doing it. Right now we have semi-automation and smart tools. So again, like things like Roto Brush 2 and Silhouette FX, Mocha Pro. Foundry has some tools as well. And these allow you to do sort of limited rotoscoping and, but they're proprietary tools. And then, they don't eliminate the manual work. So you have to do some processing, but they do kind of give, like if you're a professional artist, they give you support. You can lean on them to speed up your job. But then the idea here is that we can move to a totally automated pipeline where, we can use computer vision and machine learning to automatically detect things and separate subjects from their backgrounds, for example. So you can do, what we might call computer vision and apply it to these sort of artistic tasks. So this is actually what SAM2 does. It takes, you basically do image segmentation, and then it tracks those things that you kind of define what the boundaries are in the first frame, and then it just kind of follows through and tries to predict for subsequent frames where that background should be. And it's going to take a while to kind of get that right, because of course, the background border between the foreground and the background is always changing in a video. Sometimes, you have a very clean boundary and sometimes you don't. So it's hard to do. And this is from me kind of working with it and getting some experience with it. So there are a lot of challenges to AI rotoscoping. There's hair and fur, which can confuse AI models because that's a very fine level of detail that's hard to sort of define. Sometimes if you manually trace it, even, it's hard for the algorithm to track that boundary sufficiently. There's also motion blur, where you get like, blur, and so the boundary becomes ambiguous with motion. You get lighting variations, which can force the algorithm to misidentify different things in the video, thinking that the foreground is background and vice versa. And then, if you're trying to tell a story or you're trying to get a certain sort of global outcome, machines can't do that work for you. You have to kind of guide the machine, or you have to kind of guide the algorithm through the entire video. So you just have to have the right tools, and you can do this easily, but you still have to be thoughtful and have a method for doing this. So more rotoscoping examples here, and this is our cat. This is, of course, mapping between a person moving around. So if I took a video of this person, I could map all their movements to this rotoscoped image where I'm just taking the foreground and I'm changing the shirt color and the pants color, and the background has trees and grass, and I can change the texture and color of those things too. So I can model the scene by segmenting out every feature in the scene and then replacing it with some artistic representation. So this is Rotoscoping Animation, a Comprehensive Guide, and it just kind of goes through the history of rotoscoping. So it was actually originally used in movies in the 1910s, and it really kind of took off with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That was a Walt Disney movie in 1937. That was all done manually, so this is not something that they had. They even had special effects software for at all at that point. And then in the 1970s, we started to get a resurgence of this technique, which led us to sort of the more modern applications of this in the 2000s. And so, yes, this is definitely a thing that we would like to automate, but this is something also that is harder than it seems to do. So, also, if you're familiar with the video Take On Me by Aha, that was done completely in rotoscoped form. So it's like this music video that a lot of younger people probably have never seen, but if you go look it up on YouTube, you'll find it. And yeah, this is a good example of rotoscoping as well. And so in rotoscoping, you have to prepare your live footage. You have to import it into the software. You have to create masks, so you have to outline the areas to be rotoscoped. So, this is often kind of defining the boundaries of the objects that you want to, say, keep in the foreground or identifying the background and, masking that from images. You're not doing it from the video because you can't. You just have to do like one or more images, and then the algorithm has to interpolate all of that. Then you have to animate it by doing frame by frame tracing. And so, you can use keyframes to do those interpolations. But this is, again, something that is going to require a lot of fine tuning. Then refining the edges. So, of course, the edges are always a problem. It's always hard to get the edges just right. And you can end up with some pretty weird effects on the edges if you're not careful. Because a lot of times in videos, you'll be tracking some person, for example, and they're moving around or they're shifting just slightly, and the mask kind of slips and it just kind of cuts off things in weird ways. So it's not at all easy to do. And then, of course, we want to compose things. We want to combine the rotoscoped elements with other visual effects or backgrounds. So we want to maybe combine things across frames, but combine things within frames. So that's a little guide to that. The rotoscoping Wikipedia page kind of goes over the technique and how it was Edward Muybridge, when he produced his famous images of horses in motion, where he used what at the time was the new approach of capturing things on film. He would film these horses that were moving, and he could take this film and you could take it apart frame by frame, and we really learned a lot about how horses gallop and move around from those animations. So it's very interesting. Sometimes these new techniques open up doors to understanding things that we just kind of took for granted before. So it's really kind of interesting how, we think about, say, like science, and we think about ways to do science, and a lot of people don't think about animation as being a pathway into scientific inquiry, but it absolutely is. And so it is with image segmentation and rotoscoping as well. Now, like I said, we want to be able to implement this locally. So there is a tool, and this is an open source tool that is written for the Mac. It's called SammieROTO, and it's based on SAM2. So this is where we have a version of SAM2, a fork of SAM2 that is specialized for rotoscoping. It's called SammieROTO. And it takes a little bit of effort to install and run because you have to, of course, have the right amount of RAM, and you have to, basically the more RAM the better. Apple Silicon, you should be able to run this reasonably well. But the higher number of the chip, the better. And this allows you to sort of implement a lot of these techniques on an image. So, you can take a video clip, and you can't really take like a 2-hour movie. You really need to kind of think about things in terms of 30 seconds or a minute. Because, it's going to take a while for this thing to process. You're going to basically go in, pick a frame, segment out the edges, or segment out the features, and then run the algorithm across the video. And it's going to produce an output, of course, which may or may not be what you want. And you have to keep going back and refining it. And so you're going through the frames and you're trying to, apply this technique across frames, and you're using other techniques like keyframes to sort of link those together to guide the algorithm. And, but it's still, I think if you put some time into it, it still gives you a pretty decent result. It's really interesting the way this tool works. And then this is a little bit older tool called SmartRoto. And this is where this firm was developing a machine learning version of rotoscoping, and they did their work and they had some lessons learned from this. So this is an article I think is kind of the nice ending article because it tells us something about how people have received these kind of new tools and how they're using them. So again, using machine learning tools is, kind of reshaping industries, and art, artistic rendering is no different. And so that's why back in 2019, Foundry set out to on this project SmartRoto, accompanied by leading global visual effects company BNEG and the University of Bath. Project aimed to speed up the rotoscoping process, traditionally laborious and time-consuming. The idea was that artists would create a set of shapes and a small set of keyframes, and then SmartRoto, or this machine learning algorithm, would speed up the process by sending intermediate keyframes across the sequences. And so the project is not without its challenges, particularly as modern machine learning has shifted the focus from a machine-centric approach to a data-centric one. So the success and performance of the tool is almost entirely dependent on the quality, diversity, and size of this data set. So, you basically have this movie. Well, in SammieROTO, you have the advantage of having SAM2, which is a model that's been trained on all sorts of data. So it's seen a lot of things, as they say. And it segment anything is actually pretty good. You can do like text prompts and create images, or where you can create features from text prompts. You can segment out things just kind of by getting a general idea of their shape, and the algorithm kind of fits that to objects in the video or objects in the image. And so this point about data-centric, we have the data training of the model underneath SammieROTO, but they're kind of starting from scratch here, so they have to train these models. And so this is really kind of where, the better the data you have on different types of features, the better, for your performance. So this is, again, they had to kind of set up a pipeline from scratch. They learned some lessons here. They said it's been a great learning experience. It always is. The principal learning is that rotoscoping is very hard, and that people are going to be involved, certainly for the foreseeable future. There are a lot of considerations in the rotoscoping process that need to be taken into account before starting out on a project like SmartRoto. For example, artists don't necessarily put all the vertices and edges of shapes along corresponding image features and edges. They may just decide to put the middle of the shape elsewhere, resulting in varied edge cases that become harder to track. This is compounded by other difficult cases such as rotoscoping motion blurred objects and shapes being occluded during parts of their lifetime. Ultimately, this culminated in the realization that if you want to keep in line with artists, you need to work around how they work. So we've learned a lot more about how artists really work. So this is just kind of a, as a tool for artists, this is how we can basically improve things. So it's still a machine learning based tracking and shape consistency model. We're still imagining the user sets up their initial shapes and a few initial keyframes. And then with SmartRoto, we use this model to predict in between keyframes better than interpolated or tracked keyframes to try to reduce the amount of time they spend having to finesse in the middle. And another thing here, of course, is computational effort. So if we have like something like an M4 Mac, it's something that has a decent amount of power with respect to doing kinds of things like visual special effects. But you still have to kind of think about running something like SAM2 locally and how much memory that will actually take to do a good job. So this is another thing that is, kind of a constraint on what we can do. I know from working from the video clips that I was working with, that is extremely hard to kind of get your head around, like how it, how the output is going to look if you say define a boundary in a certain way or you define a feature in a certain way. How is that going to translate across the video? And I'm not going to show any of the work that I produced because it wasn't very good, but I'm still playing with it, so I'm trying to figure out how to use it effectively. Okay, so they basically had this, they had to train their model. The data set included over 650,000 artist animated shapes consisting of 125 million user keyframes. So that's a lot of input data for this method. This is something that has to be, at least at some level, has to be imported into this tool. Like, if you don't have an underlying image processing model that's really good at picking out features, then you really have to have really good training data. And that means collecting data from instances of rotoscoping. So this is really that was a difficult thing to do, I imagine, is getting all the data that would be useful to training the model. And then, there's this question of, well, can SAM2 actually do rotoscoping really well? I know it can segment out image, like features in an image. It can segment backgrounds, perhaps. But then when you add this artistic level, if you're going to then use that for something at the other end, should you still use SAM2 for doing those things, or do you want to switch to another tool? You might use some other kind of generative tool, or you might then switch to some sort of artistic involvement, at sort of the manual level. So all sorts of things to think about in terms of the pipeline. So yeah, this is all kind of going over their lessons learned. So this is from 2019. So this is now 7 years old, and now we have SammieROTO, and that's an open source tool. So it's not like I don't know how much people are contributing to this project. I think there is some contribution here. This is the repo for SammieROTO. So this has 4 contributors. They have the organization, Zargzrax, you have 2 human contributors, and then you have Claude, of course. So it's written in Python, and here is the sort of some of the updates. So it just came out like towards the end of last year. It actually does support Windows and Linux, so you can use Windows and Linux, but you have to be mindful of the kind of computer you're running it on. I can only speak to the Mac application myself. So they acknowledge SAM2, EfficientTam, MatAnyone, and WAN2GP. So these are all things they're using in the platform, SAM2 being the most prominent. Okay, so I wanted to go over that. I thought that was an interesting set of things that I was doing. Again, I'm not going to show you any of my experiments because they're not really worth showing, but just going over that as a technical problem and how we can approach that using automated tools.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, the scanner darkly is the I think the best example, but what was the? Is that is it related in how they did the first Lord of the Rings movie? That was that was like a hybrid. Do you remember this? Like this was like back in the 80s.
Oh, I don't
You know what
remember.
I'm talking about?
No.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can find a like IMDb link. Yeah, because there was definitely something very. Maybe this is not related. Maybe this was more an attempt to just try. This is all pre high performance computing as we know today, right?
Yeah.
So they were not able to do any of the Peter Jackson stuff. So they did it as animation to try. I mean, because it's like, how could we make such a fanciful world? But they also wanted like so much action that they needed humans. So they were like filming humans, but then trying to like merge them somehow.
Right.
I'll find it.
Okay. So this is a paper from the arXiv, and it was from late last year, and it's called Generating Computational Cognitive Models Using Large Language Models. So it's this idea of linking sort of cognitive science and large language models and what we can do with those. So let's go through the abstract. Computational cognitive models, which formalize theories of cognition, enable researchers to quantify cognitive processes and arbitrate between competing theories by fitting models to behavioral data. So right out of the box, that's kind of a controversial statement because I don't think all people would agree that like large language models generate what we could call sort of a formal form of cognition or something that you can theorize from. So, can we develop general theories of cognition from like a machine model, basically? And, that's something I think that some people would disagree with, others would agree with, however. And so this is where we're kind of, maybe the idea is that we can maybe create these sort of theories that are very utilitarian, meaning that we want to build a theory of behavior, where we just want to observe behavior and fit it to a model. And that gives us a good theory, a working theory that we can then test, say, like in animals, and get a result.
So sorry. Which sentence exactly? I found the 1978 Lord of the Rings movie that is Rotoscoping.
Okay, yeah.
but so the people would disagree with what?
Oh, with this idea that you can build formal theories of cognition from something like a large language model or any kind of AI model where it's or any kind of sort of computational intelligence.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I certainly think that in this case the authors are mainly just saying like, computational psychiatry exists.
Yeah.
Like yeah. Like yeah.
Yeah. Was this something that you posted in the Slack? I don't remember. It may have been.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay,
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
So yeah, because it seems, the this was when I think we were actually looking for a new paper for the CogSci reading group.
Oh, okay.
And I was going to not be bashful and actually suggest something that like would be more relevant for the kinds of things that I'm interested in, or making my academic research overlap with the reading group,
Right.
which, I certainly try not to do. But it's interesting because it's like this wasn't a paper that was recommended. I think I tried to use. I think I tried to use a large language model to recommend a paper. but it wasn't just like, hey, recommend a paper,
Yeah.
It was like I had to like I started with criteria in terms of limit papers to this or limit papers to that,
Right.
and then I like it said something about like using Google Scholar metrics, because I think this was still Gemini, and I was trying to like find something that in a relatively short amount of time had already gotten like citations or like anyway, this was the results.
Okay, yeah.
Of itself a large language model interaction. Yeah.
Could I suggest other large language model content?
Right. Well, and then of course, it's just like, well, what if I'd asked 5 different models?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I'm interested to go through this.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that part aside, so basically they get into kind of what we're dealing with when we deal with large language models. Traditionally, these models are handcrafted, which requires significant domain knowledge, coding expertise, and time investment. However, recent advances in machine learning offer solutions to these challenges. So this is where we have large language models and any kind of computational intelligence model. The same things hold true. You have to craft them, so one intelligence has to craft another intelligence, basically. Large language models have demonstrated remarkable capabilities for in-context pattern recognition, leveraging knowledge from diverse domains to solve complex problems, and generating executable code that can be used to facilitate the generation of cognitive models. That's kind of interesting. It's almost kind of like a take on metacognition. Like we're talking about building a cognitive model that can be a cognitive model, which is interesting. This is something that, in light of the stuff at Bika, where, we're talking about cognitive models and how they can do different things. And, you think, well, you're creating that cognitive model as a cognitive entity, creating the things that you think are important in cognition, and then applying it to a problem. And so it's kind of an interesting take on it, or at least in terms of how I'm interpreting this. Just taking some notes here. Building on this potential, we introduce a pipeline for guided generation of computational cognitive models, or what they call GECKO. And as far as I know, this was not presented at the GECKO conference. So,
That's right.
Yeah. Given task instructions, participant data, and a template function, GECKO prompts a large language model to propose candidate models, its proposals to how the data, and iteratively refines them based on feedback constructed from their predictive performance. We benchmark this approach across 4 different cognitive domains. So those include decision making, learning, planning, and memory. Using 3 open source large language models spanning different model sizes, capacities, and families. On 4 human behavioral datasets, the large language model generated models consistently matched or outperformed the large language generated models consistently matched or outperformed the best domain-specific models from the cognitive science literature. So this is where we have these models, and we're looking at large language models as sort of like this sort of general model of intelligence as opposed to domain-specific models of intelligence. So this is actually interesting from a theoretical standpoint because, you know, we think about, like, we talk about general intelligence, and then we talk about domain intelligence or specialization, and then, you know, we have to kind of think about the role that they play in cognition. So this is kind of thinking about, you know, kind of the theoretical aspect of how does cognition work, what contributes to cognition, how do we define cognition. To validate these findings, we performed control experiments that investigated 5 things. The first is that the contributions of different large language model features, those are things like model size, model family, and capacities. The second thing is the causal role of different prompt components. The third thing is the effect of data contamination. 4 is the ability to recover ground truth models from simulated data. And 5 is the total explainable variance in human behavior captured by large language model generated models. Taken together, our results suggest that large language models can rapidly generate cognitive models, with conceptual plausible models that rival or even surpass the best models from the literature across diverse test domains. So here's the repo for Gecko. This is the repo, and they have the figure, so this is, I guess, later in the paper as well. This is kind of describing this process. So this is guided generation of computational cognitive models. So they're generating cognitive models. So like you would generate hypotheses about cognition. And so this is just kind of to build a model that would, capture these aspects of this part of cognition. So that's what we're trying to do. Basically, hypothesis generation, testing hypotheses, and then contributing to some theory. So the prompts are listed here in step 1. So we have to have some sort of task description. So in this task, participants chose between 2 actions, observe feedback based on their choices. Okay, so we have to have a task description, and sometimes that task description, if we think about like your average psychology experiment, the task description has to be very, very specific. But on the other hand, sometimes those experiments don't generalize to other things like naturalistic types of experiences that one might have in that domain. So like if we're doing a learning and memory experiment, we usually are very highly structured in how we present the stimuli, how people respond to the stimuli. We don't want to confound anything because we want to get information out of that experiment that isolates things so that we can measure them and do statistical tests. But in a naturalistic setting, things are much more fluid. So those are to require 2 different cognitive models, essentially, right? I mean, you can't just build your cognitive model from like an experiment and have it generalized everything. So there are these aspects of this that are interesting. I'm not sure. I think they're just kind of running through how this is structured here. So there's a task description, then there's data. So you have data, and this is, again, drawing from this notion of a psychology experiment where you have a participant, they engage in these trials, there's an action and a reward. So you have this reward structure, you have this action structure, and you have this sort of these discrete trials. So these are the data. And again, if we did the naturalistic study, the data would look different. And then large language model guardrails. So, you want to tell the large language model what you want. Your task is to propose 3 unique cognitive models that could explain the observed behaviors in this data set. Each model should be implemented as a Python function called Model 1, Model 2, Model 3. Okay, so that's it. And then So our code template is this Python function that has actions, rewards, and parameters, and then it models the data according to this equation, and there you go. So that's the idea, and it's very cognitive science oriented. So I mean, you know, if you know how sort of the history of cognitive science, the whole history of cognitive science, one of the goals that they had was to be able to write programs to replicate intelligence or replicate cognition. So, you know, if you go back into textbooks or if you go back into a lot of the early cognitive science, people aren't just trying to do psychology experiments. They're trying to write programs, something like this, to characterize cognition or human cognition even. And it has a lot of applications of things like human factors engineering, where you're trying to optimize procedures. You might have a very long procedure for interfacing with a nuclear power plant control panel, and you have to get that sequence just right or else everyone dies. So it's very, or like if you're in a cockpit of an airplane, and it's very important to get that right with no errors. So that's what they're, you know, a lot of the task analysis there was to write these programs that would sort of go through the process step by step and allow us to understand that. So it does have this sort of you know, despite like someone might saying this isn't really cognition, it does have that sort of structure of early cognitive science and how people were thinking about, you know, the cognitive view of intelligence and things like that. So this second step is where we have a large language model. So we just pick something like QN or Llama. Then we fit our model, and then we go back to our large language model and, you know, maybe pick a new model if we need to. So we fit our model and see which one works best. There's this feedback loop that's where we say, you know, we try different models and we see which model is the best so far. So basically we apply a model to a problem. If it works well, we keep it. If not, we change it or we refine it. We keep trying and getting better and better. And then this third step is where we have the best large language model generated model. So we have this code template which represents a program. We just get a bunch of programs and we evaluate each one and we see which one is the best at modeling what we're trying to get at with our task. So once we get our best large language model generated model, we then do two things. We do a model comparison. And so this is where we have a baseline cognitive model and a best large language model. So we have like we compare this with the cognitive models I talked about in the abstract for different domains. And we use this measure BIC and we evaluate it in that way. And then we also do posterior predictive checks. So this is where you're using a posterior distribution on human data. So we might have a model prediction and we want to look at human data to make sure that it's consistent with that. Okay. So this is the repo, and you know, I'm not going to get into the software, but it does give you all the things you need to run this, theoretically, anyways. So, you know, they kind of bring up the point that a lot of times we don't have really good, you know, people might question the technical attributes of large language models for doing this sort of thing. So, you know, we might want to say, create a cognitive model. We might want to always handcraft that model because we want to make sure that it is representative of cognition. And so this is, you know, a lot of cognitive models are like this, where we think that cognition works this way, so we craft the model to incorporate those features. But of course, model building is always an exercise in abstraction. So we're taking the things that we find important, we're incorporating them into models and then leaving the other details out. And these are theories. This is theory building. I mean, it's model building, it's also theory building. When you pick certain things to be in models and certain things not to be in models, that's your theory of the mind or theory of cognition, right? So it's a theory building. And then with large language models, what we're doing is we're trying to sort of get this very large space of possible models and boil it down. And this is what they're offering, is this approach to theory building where you have a very large number of possible models and you winnow those down to the best fit to the data. So they talk about how large language models are good at this. Large language models exhibit at least 3 abilities that can facilitate the development of a flexible domain general framework for generating cognitive models. So the first is that large language models can process behavioral data, formatted in natural language, along with the corresponding task description. So we have something that is, it isn't written in computer code, and then we have to go back and map that to cognition and then map that back to a model. We actually have it's a naturalistic type of interaction. So things are stated in natural language. We can look at that like a linguist, and we can process that as behavioral data and then design tasks around it. So linguists always have, especially computational linguists, have these tasks all worked out. So they have a pretty good idea of how that fits to the study of, how to probe cognition with those kind of tasks. So this sort of natural language structure provides them with the flexibility to handle diverse task domains with varying levels of complexity. Number 2 is that they can identify patterns in complex problems using domain knowledge and context and generate hypotheses about the data generating process. So again, we need to kind of identify domain knowledge and complex problems and then link that to data. And then the ability to synthesize highly accurate programs lends itself nicely to cognitive model generation and subsequent evaluation. So the ability to build programs, synthesize programs repeatedly and refine those programs really helps us with evaluating all the different models. So with theory building, sometimes we run into this problem where we sometimes have to get lucky, and it's not a matter of blind luck. I mean, like if you think about Darwin, when he was developing the theory of natural selection, it's kind of like observed nature. And people had observed nature before him, and they had actually offered theories before him. But what he did was he took all of that prior data, those priors, and the things we knew about nature, and then synthesized it with current observations, and kind of had, I guess you could say, good luck. I mean, he didn't get everything that we maybe, how we study evolution nowadays. He didn't get all those details correct, but he had the gist of it. And that's what we're doing with this large language models. We're trying to find the gist of the theory of how cognition works. And so this is kind of the thing that large language models are doing, this type of approach is kind of picking up on, is that if you have, you can actually do a brute force search of every possible cognitive model. And that's not efficient. I mean, you could do it. It would take you a long time. But it also wouldn't be very informative because you might end up in a place that isn't really, based in reality. So you want to be able to pick up on the gist of what the idea is, like figuring out sort of an outline of the mechanics of something. And then that's what a good theory does, because it allows you to generalize. And, if there's a lot of data that you haven't seen, that it kind of fits into that framework pretty easily. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So in this work, we leverage these large language model abilities to generate hypotheses about the cognitive processes underlying human behavior. We developed a novel pipeline for guided generation of computational cognitive models, or GECKO, which helps synthesize cognitive models as Python functions using large language models and iteratively refines them based on feedback on their predictive performance. We evaluated this approach across 4 different cognitive domains: decision-making, learning, planning, and memory, using 3 open source large language models with different features including model sizes, capacities, and families. So when they first compared large language model generated models with the best domain-specific model from the literature in terms of predictive performance, then validated the best performing large language model using posterior predictive checks, as we saw in that figure. And then they conducted control experiments to understand this pipeline mechanistically. So they had this, the first one they had was a linear mixed effects model to isolate the contribution of different features of the base large language model. Number two are the large language model prompt ablations that they did to test the causal role of instruction, data, iterative feedback, and template components. I guess prompt ablations are where you modify the prompt in ways that vary or delete certain parts of the instructions and iterative feedback, so you know kind of what's driving the outcome. Log prober, that's an estimation of data contamination and prompts. So again, validating this approach. Number four, simulations to access recovery of ground truth models. Number five is a comparison with a foundation model of cognitive science, and in this case, they're using CENTAUR, which was from Binns et al. 2024, which I'm not familiar with. But this is to approximate the total explainable variance captured in human behavior. Across all domains, we found that large language model generated models matched or surpassed the best domain-specific model from the literature and captured as much explainable variance as CENTAUR, while remaining interpretable. The results from this control experiment revealed that the iterative feedback component in the prompt and the reasoning ability of the large language models are the two main drivers of this performance, with no traces of contamination in the prompt. So this is where we can do rapid cognitive model generation, and that's kind of our end goal here. So this paper, CENTAUR, I'm not familiar with this. So CENTAUR is this paper here by Binns et al.
I mean, that sounds like it's a recent cog-size specific. No, I was just looking it up. I mean,
okay.
I am curious, and I will. I'm working on a different coding project right now. I mean, still very much in my agentic coding, which this is a great example.
Yeah,
right? Like this is this paper should actually just be agentic coding for model fitting.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's just like that's what it is. But to the first point that they made, though, I think is still really is really good, which is that like how many times have your model comparisons be driven by your coding strength?
Yeah.
And if your coding strength is the a simpler example that I think is certainly I've seen is equally powerful, which is when is the Moab project, right? Which is this it's an open source project started by the French group. I mean, it was crowdsourced, but because you can test across multiple data sets, it's very powerful in terms of showing you the issues of generalization. But because you're also testing against multiple state-of-the-art algorithms that have already been implemented, you also have a kind of a higher bar. And the many papers where you test on one data set, and potentially you have to write your own comparison algorithm, right? So it's just like I worked on this for 2 years, and then I also wrote this other thing and I can do better than that. Right? It's not a it's not a real. Many times it's kind of a straw man, if you will.
Right.
And so that's something that just appealed to me about that opening paragraph there. So,
Yeah. I'm interested in how they're kind of approaching this, because you talked about kind of like theory building, and we've talked about metacognition as well, right? This is metacognition in the sense that it's evaluating a bunch of cognitive models or a bunch of things about cognition, and it's kind of coming up with it's maybe coming up with a specialized model, or it might be coming up with a more general model, but it's doing this sort of thinking about all the model space, and that's what's kind of interesting.
And I think there's really something to be said for it thinking about it in a machine way,
right?
And like I forget sorry, I don't have the paper right in front of me, but I forget the way they phrased it, but like basically, biases of the researcher can limit the models considered, or something like that.
Yeah.
So this is interesting. I mean, I'm glad I looked it up, because what I wanted to see was, of course, what did they train on CENTAUR? Right? And so they're saying it's a data set called Psych 101, which I think is hysterical.
Yeah.
So trial-to-trial data from more than 60,000 participants, performing in excess of 10 million choices. So CENTAUR not only captures the behavior of held-out participants better than existing cognitive models, but also generalizes to previously unseen cover stories, structural task modifications, and entirely new domains. Okay, I don't know what that means. Okay, so they're kind of saying, I mean, it goes on to say, like, our results demonstrate that it's possible to discover computational models that capture human behavior across a wide range of domains. So, yes, the one ring to fit cognitive theories.
Except being a Psych 101 or trained on Psych 101. I assume these are Psych 101 students. It does introduce this weird populations problem, which is like it's all based on like very uniform cognition in a sense.
Absolutely. But still better than the way that we were doing CogSci in the 90s.
Right, yeah.
I mean, in the sense of like instead of just using one small weird group.
Yeah. Yeah, and then this issue about creating a program that describes cognition. That's something that people used to just kind of build from like scratch. It was like a specification of something like an idealized description. You didn't have a lot of data going into it. It was just kind of like, this is the process. This is how we're processing knowledge, instead of saying, here are like 10,000 subjects and here's how they behave. And
it's interesting though, right? Because it's like absolutely, and a lot of that was done in an armchair fashion,
right?
Right, and so when you think about it, there's like for sure a language restriction in terms of how you're thinking about these things. I would just say that, like, I think what's certainly being missed here is just how much this is this is just a computational, it is a pure computational model, right? So it's just like, like that first part of the, or that first image that you showed is very important in this, in the sense that like this is what's actually going in is a set of, you know, kind of reaction times, which button was pressed, you know, et cetera, right? Like,
Yeah.
like, and so what the computational model is still a very, it's a very restricted view of the task. But in this case, like absolutely appropriate to have a machine generate those.
Yeah.
With a, you know, with an error function, right? I mean, like it can see, you know, it's doing this with a in the framework of a Bayesian model comparison, right? So you're looking at it's not about yeah. So it's like it's absolutely important to generate more models.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's actually very similar to. I can't believe there's already drilling at this house across the street. Like 8:30 in the morning here. It is. This is very similar to a analysis framework in neuroimaging called dynamic causal modeling.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And I think, like, you know, I've always tried to say that, like, I think what's really powerful about it is not that it's like, you know, a fancy differential equations model that can say something useful about neuroimaging data, but it's like it's that the important part of it is try and propose like 3 or 4 models. And you use this Bayesian model comparison to say, of the evidence that I've collected, there's the most, you know, this model is the most likely, you know, and that is the limit of your, that's what you are restricted to in terms of conclusion. Right. It's like you can't, yeah. And so that's another nice thing about it is that like, I think it makes it very, you know, in that kind of Bayesian way, it's you can only speak of what you've put together in a model. And yeah, you know.
Yeah, definitely. It's I think it's really good at, you know, like when we're building theories, we want to explore the entire space, especially for something like cognitive science, where we think we have the right theories, but we don't really have good theories in the sense of like really deep conceptual theories. Like, you know, we kind of think about cognition as information processing. And then if we go to the domain of neuroscience, we don't have really much theory at all. So, you know, linking like cognitive science to neuroscience and looking at those data, that's a place where we can get some new theories.
Yep.
But we don't really have, you know, people haven't really done that work
Yep.
to kind of integrate. I mean, there's some cognitive neuroscience, there are some theories there, but like still, it's like we're not anywhere near a good grounding in that. So yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you for posting that paper. I was interested in it and I wanted to go through it. So, do you have any updates to give?
I'm gonna jump jump in the car or head on the Muni soon to meet Neurotech of Berkeley's wetware group. So they're coming to the lab to Biopunk to have a look at the cell culture facility. So yeah, it would be, we'll be talking today about what kind of, neuronal culture they want to try. I mean, they obviously want to do dish brain, but hopefully we can get to the point where they have a stable kind of cell culture facility space to work into culture, to train, and then to test, right? And so we'll talk about that. We've got the global hackathon. We got 2 hackathons coming. One is in mid-March, and one is like sort of beginning mid-April. So the first one's protocol labs, and that's going to be really interesting. I still am not quite sure what we're going to do. I'd like to do something that is kind of up to the kinds of things that Protocol Labs funds, which is kind of very invasive, is very cellular and, invasive recordings, expansion microscopy, connectomics. But I'm not quite sure how to put that together in a hackathon. Yeah, and just trying to get more stuff done at Neurotech X. Like, I got a new website. That was I was impressed. It wasn't sufficient as an agentic coding project for my fellowship, which is why I'm working on something else. Even though there's no way I could have done this in the time that, as quickly as I did, with as the features that it has, and successfully deployed it and mapped to neurotechx.org, right? Like, like it's up, it's running. It's actually being, it's a modern development stack being hosted in a modern, fast, way. So it should be good. I'm working out a deal where Neurotech at Berkeley is going to take what I've done and kind of finish it up. And this is important because it's like I really want the website to be a living website, like it's got fresh content that is just that I don't have to post. It's being replenished with content, as well as like it is a member driven site. So people can contribute to the site, but they don't need to have access to the site to contribute. So either it's I receive RSS feed, or if you want your project listed, all you have to do is tag NeurotechX in your GitHub repo, and this will automatically grab those. Like you might have to wait a day, but then your project can be listed and things like that. So this is something that we've wanted to have for years, where it's just like the student groups could update, things about their club, or they could add projects to get, more people interested. That's definitely, again, what I really want from it, is like to be a hub where people can collaborate on things.
and really trying to encourage the student groups to talk to each other and try to do more. I think that's it. We've got a paper next week. SF CogSci reading group will meet. I should probably figure out what that paper is and maybe read it this weekend. And on Thursday next week, we've got Brian Pepin from Ruin Labs. This is a company that focuses on Parkinson's. So this is one of the neurotech meetings that I'm hosting, but it's great. There's a startup in the tower who's she's like doing these fireside chats with startup founders, CEOs. So it's great because she's very comfortable doing these things. So I'm much more comfortable organizing it in the background. But I am trying to make it where, we're, each time we do this, like, we're going to do it better in terms of, like, I'm hoping this time we'll be live streaming it and the video recording will go to our YouTube, so fingers crossed, because I actually lost, my computer crashed halfway through the last fireside chat, so I lost the video of the first speaker, which is like, yeah. I think that's it. The next big meeting is Cosine in March 3rd or something like that. But it's in Portugal. But then the meeting after that is Cognitive Neuroscience Society, which is up in Vancouver. So kind of thinking about trying to make it to that. It would be 25 years since I presented my first poster at CNS. It's sad to say that the first poster I presented was in the World Trade Center in New York. Yeah, so summer before September 11th, or spring, summer. Yeah. But 25 years, and yeah, it'd be nice to see what they're doing in that meeting. But it's also up in Vancouver, and the Vancouver's the spot where I'm really trying. Like, that's the last kind of part of Canada where, like, Neurotech X doesn't have any good. We've got professors in Toronto and other places now, and I'm focused on Montreal, but Vancouver would be great. And so, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about this week.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
Well, and then agentic coding wise, I am taking a new EEG foundation model and working on making it into a container that I can like deploy for others, and yeah, continuing to try and develop my skills in terms of what's the new way of doing things. So, and I don't know if it's worth going to PyGTC. I mean, sorry, the NVIDIA's GTC.
Oh yeah.
But like,
I'm very happy to focus on JAX, but like I will say that there is a massive ecosystem around PyTorch, and if you want to run PyTorch, and you got a big model, then you're gonna want to run it on a NVIDIA chip and CUDA and so this DGX Spark is really a dev system for that stack, and so I think I was catching videos from BrainHack School 2020, Montreal, and it's two professors in Montreal that are very, very big in open science and open source, and one of the things that they were saying was it's like they were surprised at how few people that they did a survey of the students when the students started, and they were like, we're surprised that so few of you have actually used Git and containers.
Wow.
and and I think one of the reasons that you see that is that despite their ubiquity in they are essential in what's called DevOps.
Yeah.
Right. And so anybody who's a software engineer, anybody certainly who's a software engineer in internet activities, right, like has to deal with containers, and has to think about those kinds of issues. But I think assuming or expecting that students have experience with this, it's really been interesting to. Do you know the MIT Missing Semester course?
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So they just did 2026, and of course, Missing Semester is like a week-long class that you have before the. It's not a semester. It's I don't know if all schools have this, but like there's kind of like a week before semester starts where there's kind of like optional things or do you know what I'm talking about? I forget what they call it. Like Oxford has this too. Anyway, they run this as like a week long thing before the semester starts, but like the students are already back, and it covers the usual things in terms of just like getting people really familiar with the command line, but they definitely covered things like I think this has got to be the first year that they covered agentic coding.
I'm sure. Yeah.
One of the comments on YouTube was, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen."
Meaning that they think agentic coding is beneath MIT.
Yeah, but so I think it's hard for people to hold. These ideas might seem contradictory or but that like there could be an AI bubble, and we could see a massive collapse of a bunch of companies. But the agentic coding could still be a really powerful thing.
Right. Yeah.
and I am, as I get better at controlling an autonomous agent, right? I could not match the breadth and sheer the tirelessness of the coding agent that's taking, that's working on my laptop right now.
Yeah.
And and the other thing being that it's working on my laptop, and it's outsourced the computational work to a headless box that is basically just a NVIDIA GPU in a box, right? Like a DGX Spark is just the smallest enclosure for a dev chip from NVIDIA. Right? And so you run a container, you run a container on the DGX Spark, but you control it from your laptop.
Right.
And I've got a coding agent that's actually in the container, so it is like having an active participant that can be tracking the actual hard, so it's actually finding LLVM compiler issues that have to do with the fact that a Blackwell chip is so new.
Yeah.
And all these other kinds of hardware things. It's a real assistant.
Right.
That we need to be able to show students how to use.
Right.
Anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay.
I might have to get on the road. I got to meet students in an hour.
Okay.
But
Well,
I'll be in the room.
Okay. All right. So first of all, yeah, you did have the Lord of the Rings reference. This is the Rotoscoping from 1978. Yeah, this is
right.
Yeah.
I'm dating myself, but like I saw that in the theater.
Yeah.
I mean, I was 8 years old.
Right. Yeah. Captures the imagination at that age. So.
It was as for a boy who read Lord of the Rings at like 6 or 7, like, it was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean these kinds of tools that I talked about in that feature, those are becoming sort of available to people to do home stuff. Like you don't have to be a big movie studio to do those kinds of things anymore. At least for short films. We'll see how that works out in practice. So yeah, SammieROTO was released like late last year. So it's like been literally months since we really had something that people can just access and do stuff with, which is always the benchmark, right? Like if you want things to kind of open up beyond just kind of like maybe one director or one art team, then you got to have the tools. So okay, I'm going to talk about a paper to finish up here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, this is it here. So I'm going to talk about a paper to finish up here. This is it's a target article from Behavior and Brain Sciences. So if you're not familiar with target articles, they're kind of like these articles that people write and then people respond to them, and be pages and pages of responses. The responses, of course, are like articles in of themselves sometimes, short articles, and they kind of go through, a certain topic. It's usually a niche topic in cognitive science or in neuroimaging or something. And so this has been a tradition for decades where people write these target articles and people respond to them. So, this is kind of an open peer commentary before it became cool, I guess, is the idea. Okay, so this article is called A Multi-Trait Embodiment Framework for the Evolution of Brains and Cognition Across Animal Phyla. So it's stitching together this idea of phylogenetic cognition, which of course is a theory of cognition, which is very different from, say, like an information processing theory of cognition, at least nominally, because you're talking about basically the question of how does animal cognition evolve? How are forms of animal cognition related across taxa? So if I look at animal cognition in primates, how does that differ from animal cognition in social insects, from animal cognition in cetaceans, and animal cognition like in dogs, cats, and rats? And just like different forms of cognition, how are they all related by common ancestry? How are they unique? And then this is, the idea of embodiment. So we, need to think about cognition in terms of being embodied in a body. So that's kind of what this article is about. So this is from Bowling Green State University in Ohio has a pretty good cognitive science program there. It's very biologically oriented. So this is Cheryl Coombs and Michael Trestman. Okay, so the abstract here reads, among non-human animals, crows, octopuses, and honeybees are well known for their complex brains and cognitive abilities. Widening the lens from the idiosyncratic abilities of exemplars like these to those of animals across the phylogenetic spectrum begins to reveal the ancient evolutionary process by which complex brains and cognition first arose in different lineages. The distribution of 35 phenotypic traits in 17 metazone lineages, so they did an analysis of different phenotypic traits in different lineages, different taxa, reveals that the brain and cognitive complexity in only 3 lineages can be attributed to the pivotal role played by the body, sensory, brain, and motor traits in active visual sensing and visual motor skills. So those 3 lineages are vertebrates, cephalopod mollusks, and eutheropods. So those are, like not species level groupings, but their groupings. Vertebrates includes a vast number of taxa. Cephalopod mollusks includes a large number of taxa, and eutheropods as well. So they've kind of defined the places in the tree of life where we have this specific type of thing we think of as biological intelligence, or typically think of as biological intelligence. So this is where we have sensory systems, we have a body, we have motor traits, and visual motor traits that kind of come together. And of course, that's, not all of biological intelligence, but that's kind of where you get a common set of traits. Together, these pivotal traits enabled animals to transition from largely reactive to more proactive behaviors. So this is where you have planning, you have prediction, you don't have these kind of reflexes that govern the behavior or dominate the behavior. You have these planning behaviors. You have, types of visual intelligence where you can imagine a different world and then act upon it. Those sorts of things. And so these pivotal traits established animals to transition from reactive to proactive behaviors and from slow and 2-dimensional motion to more rapid and complex 3-dimensional motion. So this is like if you have motion that isn't based on planning, you don't want to move too far out ahead of yourself. You have a kind of a reference frame that might be like, crawling along a branch, and you're just kind of crawling to the next spot where you're sensing like a pheromone concentration or a gradient of pheromone, and you're following that gradient. And that's, of course, these are known as taxis, and that's very indicative of what we like to call very simple cognition In this case, it would be slow and two-dimensional motion, where you're following this gradient from low concentration to high concentration. There's no planning necessarily, it's just following the gradient. Right? We can do this in like a Bradenburg vehicle. We see this in different insects. We see this in cells. We see this in bacteria. So this is something that is differentiated from complex three-dimensional motion, where you have to plan, where you have this dimension of height. So you have 3 dimensions of space that you're behaving in, and you need to be able to kind of build a model of that within yourself. So you have these internal models that come along with this that are predictive. Among pivotal traits, high-resolution eyes and laminated visual regions of the brain stand out because they increase the processing demands and the computational power of the brain by several orders of magnitude. So this is interesting. High-resolution eyes, of course, are important for sort of getting the information in, being able to sense the environment without, having these very simple sensors that are, two-dimensional, or just basically pick up the information from a gradient, and they pick up like an image of the world. So you have, of course, camera eyes, but you also have compound eyes, and those are 2 examples of that, where you can get that kind of information into the brain. And then laminated visual regions, which are the part of the brain where you get the structure that's specialized for visual processing. So when they say laminated, they're thinking about like the visual pathway in mammals, where you have multiple centers, or you have multiple layers of processing. So like if we think of the V1 and V2 and V3 and V4 areas of the visual cortex, we have these layers, layered cortex, but also we have these layered regions where you're passing the job off to different modules or different components of this pathway. And, lamination, I think, is important because it allows and we have like in neocortex, we have 6 layered cortex. So we have 6 layers of processing. But we also have 2 layered cortex as well in some species. And the point of this lamination, you can draw a comparison with deep learning, where they discovered that, of course, the more layers you have, the better. But in biological brains, these laminated layers allow you to sort of segregate processing. So you can start at the top with like very simple processing, and you can move down in different layers. And this helps in development, because in development you can get this kind of specialization emerge that you might not be able to get if you just had like kind of one pot of cells that were kind of, having to wire up on their own. It just gives you this, these developmental precursors develop this kind of specialization. Eyes and these laminated visual regions stand out because they increase the processing demands and the computational power of the brain by several orders of magnitude. So this is the sort of the finding. The independent acquisition of pivotal traits in cognitively complex, or CC, lineages, so they define these lineages that they identify with these traits, is cognitively complex, can be explained as the completion of several multi-trait transitions over the course of evolutionary history, each resulting in an increasing level of complexity that arises from a distinct combination of traits. So whereas combined pivotal traits represent the highest level of complexity in CC lineages, combined traits at lower levels characterize many non-CC lineages, suggesting that certain body, sensory, and brain traits may have been linked. So this is what they call the trait linkage hypothesis, which is where you have this linkage, this maybe genetic linkage, or certainly this linkage across evolution where things evolve together. And so you have things that are, they change together, they're conserved together, and they contribute collectively to this higher level of cognitive complexity. And they may also contribute to non-cognitive complexity, so that, it may prevent certain species from becoming cognitively complex, or you need to have everything in place. You basically need to have those things linked in order to have cognitive complexity. So it's an interesting analysis here, and kind of getting into what they propose here. The first is that narrowly distributed pivotal traits enable essential cognitive abilities not previously present, making complex cognition possible. So there are these pivotal traits that define different lineages as cognitively complex, and then two lineages with brain and cognitive complexities follow very similar evolutionary paths, involving major transitions from lesser to greater levels of complexity, with different combinations of traits at each level. Okay. So they're basically answering the question, how did cognition evolve? But they're also answering the question of what is complex cognition? What does it involve, and what can we target? If we look at the tree of life, or we look at sort of take a phylogenetic view of cognition, if we consider all organisms that exhibit different types of complex behavior, things we might consider to be complex. They could be octopus, or it could be crows, or it could be social insects, or it could be humans. And we consider all of those different types of forms of cognition. What do they share in common? And then maybe what are the things that are unique, but also maybe are very similar? So what's convergent? So this is where we're getting, all of this, and this is what, why we're doing this is to sort of figure out the sort of the breadth of cognition for all of the complexity of cognition across the tree of life. How can we best define complexity in cognition? It's one thing to look at humans and say, we'll just copy humans. It's another thing to actually think about how cognition has played out across species. When given the opportunity, can we evolve different versions of cognition? Or, are there just certain contexts where, some types of cognition are favored over others? And, so in this paper, they give some putative examples of complex cognition in three lineages. They look at vertebrates, cephalopod mollusks, and eutheropods. So vertebrates, we have two examples, New Caledonian crows and scrub jays. And of course, those are organisms, species that are very famous for being able to manipulate tools, being able to plan for food resources, having a theory of mind, or being able to mentally attribute other cognitive states, and then having a good level of spatial memory, or being able to build cognitive maps. Of course, they use these things for food caching, for manufacturing tools, for moving their food and recaching. So a lot of this involves, sort of strategic abilities and manipulating the environment. And so, this is there's a certain brain architecture there. There's certain things that bird cognition focuses on, and so those are, again, we could build, say, like an AI system, or we could hypothesize that cognition is all about what birds do, and we could copy birds, and we could be okay. But we also have to consider maybe some other systems and show how those things maybe are convergent, or maybe they're unique. So then we turn to cephalopod mollusks. Those are octopus, cuttlefish, and squid. They also, of course, also use tools. They exhibit significant behavioral flexibility beyond sort of reactive behaviors. They have complex visual communication, these chromatophores in their skin to signal each other and to signal predators and things like that, or signal prey. And they can do this very easily. And then they also have spatial memory and cognitive maps. And then eutheropods, which are basically social insects, honeybees and dragonflies, and they have a lot of these same features. They also have referential communication, and they have very involved, very elaborate behaviors for working together, building honeycombs, foraging behaviors, and being able to predict prey trajectories. So all of those are kind of like, taken as like a set of diverse types of intelligences. And then thinking, in Michael Levin, I know he does the diverse intelligences thing where he has this idea of competencies and you gain different competencies. In this case, what we're trying to do is find sort of a unified toolkit for all of different, all different sort of examples of cognition in nature. And so that's what they did with their analysis. They had this distribution of 35 traits into 5 categories. You have the body, sensory, brain, motor, and behavioral and cognitive. And then this is, of course, across 14 non-cognitively complex lineages, but also 3 cognitively complex lineages. So to look, of course, at things that have intelligence and things that don't, and maybe why they don't. And so this is sort of a story of parallel evolution of mind and body. So we know kind of how many different ways has this been done in evolution, and that can help us build theories of cognition. So again, this is a phylogeny here of animals. So we start with the basal metazoan, first metazoan. And of course, we have sponges that branch off early. We have eumetazoa, which are ctenophores, cnidarians, some marine invertebrates going up to chordates, and then going up to marine invertebrates. And then, we have vertebrates in chordata. And, we have all of our biodiversity in this tree, in animals. So we have biotarians, we have different evolutionary paths to these different taxa. And so, you can imagine, like, if we were to take sort of a common ancestor view of this, we look at, say, like chordata versus echinoderms, or chordata and bryozoans, or chordata and eutheropods. We have to assume that if they share cognitive traits, they might share them at a common ancestor. So the common ancestor, for example, of chordata and eutheropoda is bioetaria. So if we think, okay, well, those two clades or groups share different cognitive traits, that they originated in the common ancestor. But that's probably not reasonable, because maybe they don't, maybe they don't share, maybe that common ancestor isn't the origin for every trait. Maybe cognition is a matter of convergent or parallel evolution. In other words, those abilities evolved independently in these 2 different lineages, but basically got to the same place. That suggests that the environment has much more of a role to play, but also the sort of linkage has much more of a role to play. That there are different traits that are linked, and that linkage enables the evolution of intelligence. So that's the idea here, is that you have convergent evolution and common ancestry, and it's a balance between the two to explain cognitive evolution. This just shows the diversity of brains. These are bird brains on the left, these are insect brains in the middle, and then cephalopod brains on the right. And you can see that there are these different structures, or different sets of structures, that are involved in these different seats of intelligence. So you have these first order sensory regions, which are visual regions, optic lobe, olfactory lobe, olfaction being scent. So we have, sensory inputs. We also have low to mid-level motor regions. So we have a cerebellum, we have a medulla oblongata, and we have subiasphageal mass, or ganglion. Those are things that are involved in motor control and in motor behaviors. In birds, of course, we have a very large cerebellum and a medulla oblongata. In insects, we have the SMSG, and then in cephalopods, we also have an SMSG region as well. So there are different ways in which the anatomy sort of does the same things or similar things. So they're different anatomical structures. They're specialized to different degrees, but they'll kind of do similar things. And then the mid-level visual motor regions, like the optic tectum, the lobula plate complex, and the medulla, are all kind of in different, so we have the optic tectum in birds, we have the lobula plate complex in insect brains, and then the medulla specialized in cephalopods. We also have snails down in D, so they have, they're non-cognitively complex. And so they have this very different neural architecture. So this just goes to show you kind of a negative control here. And so, this just shows you how different neural architectures can yield similar behaviors, convergent behaviors. Now, that being said, you also have things that evolve kind of together. You can have cerebellum that does similar things, but maybe it has a similar kind of function, but very different kinds of behavioral outcomes in, say, birds and in mammals. So this is kind of, this balance of common ancestry and convergent evolution. Okay, so this is kind of what we're talking about here. And so developing common standards is difficult for several reasons, not the least of which is that cognition in general is a very fuzzy concept, one that involves different defining characteristics in different disciplines, and one that arguably may not even be amenable to any strict categorical definition. So, and then these are the kind of their traits. So they have these, again, this is kind of like this Michael Levin gaining competencies idea, where you have foundational traits, intermediate traits, and advanced traits in these different categories. So again, we have foundational traits in a large number of lineages. We have striated muscle, neurons, and nerve tissue. Those are, across all of our lineages. We have multimodal sensing in most of them, but not all of them. Mobility, bilateral symmetry, those, the window is starting to narrow there. Image-forming eyes, polarized locomotion, central nervous system, olfactory sensation, and then limited associative learning. And those are all these foundational traits. Not every lineage has the ones that are higher up on this stack. Then we have the intermediate traits, so we have structured brains, motor hierarchies, appendular locomotion, appendicular locomotion, object manipulation, 3D mobility. Those are all intermediate, and those are shared by a smaller number of lineages. Then what's shared by a smaller number of lineages still are these advanced traits like flexible limbs, 3D motion sense, high resolution eyes, associative learning, and these are in these three up at the top, 3D motion sense, and UAL and CPF. Those are in these cognitively complex lineages only. So we get this buildup of traits that lead to this complex cognition, and the complex cognition lineages share these three traits at the top, but also share all these other things down below. So you can see that the number of advanced traits in cognitively complex lineages is higher than, say, like something like annelids, where it's not cognitively complex. And then there are other non-cognitively complex lineages that have very few, if any, of the traits on the list. All right, so then they talk about laminated centers of the brain. We have the laminated visual centers, where we see that this gives these organisms that have this sort of lamination an advantage in terms of processing. It allows you to take an image from a photoreceptor layer, go down to multiple layers of lateral inhibitory and excitatory connections. Goes down to efferent neurons tuned to different visual features. It provides centers for processing, high-level and mid-level centers. And then this is mapped to different structures in different types of brains. So you have theropods, vertebrates, and cephalopod mollusks, and they're just different, so the cerebrum in vertebrates is equivalent to the protocerebrum in eutheropods. The optic tectum in vertebrates translates to the lobula plate in eutheropods. And in cephalopods, it's the optic medulla and the supra oseopharyngeal mass in respectively. Okay, so this is kind of going through all this, and then so they propose a number of evolutionary transitions. So their first transition is from undifferentiated tissues to differentiated nerve and muscle tissues. The second is from non-bilateral to bilateral symmetry. The third is from limbless bodies to bodies with paired appendages. The fourth is emergence of flexible limbs. And then, of course, we have cognitive outliers, which are these advanced traits in non-cognitively complex lineages. So these are, they may exhibit some aspects of cognitively complex behavior, but they don't have all of these traits. So they're, of course, cognitive outliers. And so this is, a problem with all theories is that sometimes you have edge cases or things that don't quite fit the theory. But I think this is kind of an interesting theory because it does incorporate a lot of the tree of life. Okay, this is the open peer commentary. So this is getting down to where people are now responding to this target article. And this is where people will kind of write on different aspects of the target article and kind of bolster what's been written. So, this is an article challenging the central brain dogma, new experimental insights from the moon jellyfish. This is just kind of going through their experiment here, or their model system. And this is where they argue that cognitive complexity, the idea that follows a single centralized trajectory, overlooks key gaps. So basically that you haven't, we don't have enough cognitive studies on, other than in model organisms to really say anything about this. Also, thinking about alternative neuroarchitectures, how exotic can they be and still support complex behavior? And ecological niches, sometimes niche pressures are very important in defining cognitive complexity. This is another article or response. Cognitive imbalance is chicken and egg. Motivational force evolved alongside cognition, thinking about the role of motivation. This is an article, Pain and the Evolutionary Origins of Subjective Experience, with a nice picture of a deer with a brain cutaway, describing sort of what a deer would do in the presence of a predator, and thinking about that naturalistic view of behavior and cognitive complexity. This response is beyond the C-squared brain. Cognition is inseparable from sensory motor action, so really rooting cognition and sensory motor action. So really, a lot of these responses are really kind of unpacking this article and saying, where does it work, where does it fall short, and all of that. This response is what's complex about complex cognition, and the idea that just challenging the idea of complexity as a criterion. This one's on sleep, considering REM sleep-like stages amongst the traits defining cognitively complex lineages. So sometimes people draw from their own expertise. This is social cognition, a crucial indicator of higher order cognitive ability across the animal phyla, kind of thinking about social cognition as sort of the milestone, the key thing that defines complex cognition. This one is evolution of social cognitive cell adaptations in unicellular organisms with complex mating traits, of thinking about single cell organisms and how they fit into this framework. This is Sarah-C, a core mechanism underlying G in evolution and development. So thinking about different measures of intelligence, or human G or animal G, G being the parameter for intelligence. This is Sarah-G, which is search, align, relate, abstract, and cognize, which is a core mechanism that they propose for intelligent behavior. This is Carrie Figdor, how to build a phylogenetic bridge to charismatic cognition. Carrie Figdor does a lot of work on defining this phylogenetic approach as a philosopher. And so this is really interesting in terms of the theory development. This is complex cognition and context. This is Vincente Raja, who does a lot of ecological psychology. So they kind of bring ecological psychology into the mix. Then tracing life-mind continuity and pivotal traits, world models and isomorphism. This is interesting from some of the things we've been doing with thinking about cybernetics and thinking about regulation. They argue that the features which are critical to sophisticated human cognition and late phylogenetic development are already present in the traits highlighted in the target article as pivotal for the development of cognitive complexity. So this is, and so I'm going to leave it there. I think this is definitely something that we could dig through all day and find interesting responses to. And so, yeah, that's a great article. So, yeah, it's kind of a different take on theory building from what the large language model was doing. But, you know, these are ways of doing this, different ways of kind of getting to the same thing. Yeah. Well, there he is. Morgan's on the road.
I'm down in the tunnels of San Francisco, just heading to the lab.
All right.
So I was listening in. It's a little hard to follow on the train, but I certainly used to greatly enjoy those target articles plus replies. So I'm sure that's a good answer.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's call it a meeting. Thank you for attending, Morgan, and your updates. And,
so should be a good week.
Yeah.
All right.
Talk to you next week. Bye.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.